Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for Immigration 101. This week, what am I even saying? Today, we're going to focus on asylum. So as you know, my name is Sarah John. I am the director of the Interfaith Committee on Latin America, or IFCLA, and I'm delighted that my colleague Nicole is here today. Nicole?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here. My name is Nicole Cortez, and I am one of the co-directors at the Migrant and Immigrant Community Action Project, the MICA project, and excited to do this webinar today.
All right. So for those that are just joining, welcome, welcome. We are going to dive right in because we have a lot to cover today. So today we're going to focus on very top level as we can stand, because most of us like to dive in a little bit deeper. But we're going to dive into just asylum and what that means and what it looks like. So we'll talk about law and policy. And then we will talk about realities for people seeking asylum here in Missouri or in the Midwest. And then we will conclude with action opportunities. And we are trying to save about 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. But with that, I will please invite you to pop your questions into the chat as we go, and we can hopefully incorporate some of the answers as we go. So I do also just want to start out by saying that this is a 101 course, but for those of you that are somewhat familiar with IFCLA, you know that I want to just maybe say that we are not starting, I'm going to make some certain assumptions here today, right? So we hold certain principles and values true in any conversations that we're talking about immigration or global migrations. Part of it is that we are, for example, we are aware of root causes and push and pull factors. We know about US intervention and the varied impacts that histories and decades of intervention has abroad. And what that means for co-responsibility, right? And how the US can share responsibility for the realities that we're seeing today. The other sort of big piece that I just want to name briefly is that we know that immigration law and policy in the United States, much to my surprise when I first started studying these topics, is not in reflection or in response to sort of like global needs and how populations are shifting, right? The United States uses immigration law and policy to further other agendas, right? And you can see that, and we talk about that in other courses, but I'm just kind of naming that here because it is sort of an underlying factor in some of the ways that we talk about asylum. And finally, I just want to sort of offer a reflection as we move in to this conversation about choice. I think a lot of times it is easy for those of us maybe with privilege, whatever that looks like for you, to make assumptions about how other people make decisions or what choices or decisions they have available to them to make, right? When I think we're talking about immigration and some of these other factors, I also want to encourage us to think about when are the times that we took away, we as a nation, we as a country, we as global nation states, right, have taken away the opportunity or ability for individuals and families in other countries to make choices. So I just would invite you to kind of wrestle with that word throughout this conversation. So with that, I'm going to pass it to you, Nicole.
Okay, and so as Sarah mentioned, although this is a 101 about asylum, we are certainly not going to give you all of the information that's included in sort of the more general Immigration 101 presentations that IFCLA has done, and we will go over some of the basics, but just to a disclaimer that this is not all of the things that you should know about immigration law. But we can go ahead and get started on the next slide, just a little bit of an overview about sort of how people who weren't born in the United States might show up in the United States. So there are sort of temporary ways that people come, students, visitors, people who come for business or temporary opportunities in the United States. And so those are all referred to as non-immigrants. So they are usually in the form of a visa or some other sort of permission to come and stay temporarily in the United States, but with no necessary path to stay forever. And then there are folks who come and we refer to, although all of these people in some of our heads might be referred to as immigrants, people in this middle category are often on what's called an immigrant visa or apply for some sort of immigrant status. So that part in this context just implies that it is permanent or on a path to permanency. So in that category would be refugees and asylees, which we'll talk a lot more about those today. Folks who are pursuing legal status, permanent legal status in the United States through a family-based petition or an employer who's petitioning for them. And then of course, others that might be on a path to permanent status through other sort of lesser known ways. And then there are folks who came through maybe multiple of these levels of immigration benefits and then ended up naturalizing or becoming US citizens, applying for US citizenship and being granted that. And so therefore are here as long as they want to be. And then other ways, just to go a little deeper into how people's statuses might, but people who are in the United States might be currently existing. So lots of folks are in process always, right? Like it feels like immigration is sort of this forever process until you get to, as I mentioned, that naturalized citizenship state where you don't have to be always paying for an form or filing something. And so often people are applying for a green card. That LPR acronym is lawful permanent residence or a green card. They might be applying for asylum or some sort of temporary status. And then there's folks who are in the United States who don't have status. Principally, that can be divided into two groups: people who entered and never had a visa or some sort of status, or who may have come on one of those non-immigrant visas, so one of those statuses that we talked about in that first category, but who overstayed their given amount of time. And then there's folks who are in between, as I said, might be working with a lawyer to fight a deportation case and presenting a defense to deportation that might give them legal status. The DACA program is an example of folks who are sort of in between this undocumented and documented status, but not on a path to anything permanent.
Nicole, would you also say that folks in this in between, I think a lot of times I feel like it's like a light switch when I think about immigration, you either like have status or you don't. But would you also say that like folks who are in between don't have status, but could be protected from deportation? And so they're like here and it's like okay for them to be here, but they're not on a path.
Right. Yes. I think, and a lot of the way the reality is for people is that there's a lot of people in that sort of status. That's not a path, or that's not a permanent, or that's, nothing sort of that doesn't need a next step. But for the moment, they're not just sort of fully undocumented or undetected, living, without any interaction with the system.
Yeah, and I think thanks for clarifying that. I think when we start with this presentation, with this conversation, it's important to think about like why these distinctions are important for IFCLA, and I would assume, right, for the incredible community that's on this call or that might listen to this later, that we know that there is not, by showing these distinctions or understanding them, is not to suggest that there's a hierarchy of value among people with different distinctions. But we also know that these sort of types of entry and the types of statuses that you could be in also have significant impacts in your lived experience in the United States with regard to immediate and long-term like permanency or protection, right? Thinking about family unity and protection from deportation. It also shapes the way you have access to resources, both money and services, including in the St. Louis region. And then it also can be a barrier to full inclusion in the long term. And I want to be really clear that like, just because you're a US citizen, we all know doesn't mean you are fully included in society. We all know that legal status doesn't undo the layers of other injustice that we are constantly fighting. And we know that legal status is a barrier to even get to that level of the fight, right? So I just wanted to name that before we move on.
And just a little more information, like I said, most of our presentation today is going to focus sort of on these first two, especially that second category of asylum. But our immigration laws, for as restrictive and limited as they are in the benefits that they give, they do have provisions that allow for the protection of folks who have suffered violence. So a lot of times this violence is something that's happened outside of the United States, as in the case of a refugee or someone seeking asylum. And then these last few, temporary protected status that exists for, that's TPS there, and that lower bullet point exists when there's been sort of like a natural disaster or some sort of unrest in a country, and folks who are present in the United States might benefit from that distinction. or designation, I'm sorry. And then humanitarian parole can be for something that has happened outside in your home country and you're allowed into the United States. And of course, as we've heard in the news, this special immigrant visa that has been created to address the needs to protect some of the Afghans who were of assistance to the United States during the war. The U visa and the VAWA self-petition, sort of there in the middle, those allow for protection for folks who have been in the United States and suffered harm within the United States, either at the hands of a US citizen or permanent resident as a spouse in the VAWA context, or the U visa, which provides protection for victims of certain violent crimes that happen in the United States.
So within this sort of broad scope that we've just, there was your introduction to immigration law, yay. And so within that broad scope, now we want to drill down and really focus in on asylum. So let's maybe start with some pretty basic definitions, right? Asylum is a protection that is granted to foreign nationals. Sorry, I should have prefaced by saying this is asylum in the United States. So we're going to use a lot of US centric language here, but certainly we could explore the comparative ways that asylum is used globally. But in the United States, it's a protection granted to foreign nationals who are already here or who are arriving at the border who meet the international law definition of a refugee, right? And so that definition comes from the UN 1951 Convention and then the subsequent 1967 protocols, which define a refugee as a person who is unable or willing to return to their home country and cannot obtain protection in that country due to past persecution or well-founded fear of being persecuted in the future. And that persecution has to come from one of five different sort of categories, right? That persecution could be on account of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, which I'll have Nicole just give a quick example of, or your political opinion.
So I can talk, I will dig in sort of to that definition, because I think, as Sarah mentioned, the origins of our asylum system and certainly of the sort of global refugee system did come out of post World War II, right? The world came together after the events of World War II and after what happened in Germany and beyond, and said these things never need to happen again. And we, as a lot of the countries in the world, agree that there are certain sort of baseline things that we agree to provide protection for. And so the US sort of adopted this pieces of this UN protocol and codified it, sorry for the sirens outside my window, codified it into United States immigration law, expressly stating our obligations to provide protection as the United States to folks who have suffered this persecution or might suffer it in the future. So in 1980, there was the whole act dedicated to the processing of refugees and set up sort of this different system for if you are seeking this designation from outside of the United States, you are seeking the designation of a refugee. If you're seeking protection once you're here in the United States, that will be under our asylum law, and you will be referred to as an asylum seeker and looking to become an asylee. So there's the code site for what is our immigration law. That INA is the Immigration and Nationality Act. And so states that an individual is eligible for asylum, so again, present in the United States, if they meet that refugee definition. And so as Sarah mentioned, those 5 protected grounds become really relevant, especially when folks are here, because that is where sort of you get to make the argument of why you would suffer harm. And so I think race, religion, nationality, political opinion, those are all sort of self-explanatory, although political opinion can get interesting and a little bit hairy. But membership in a particular social group, you'll notice probably sounds like not a very defined term, and that's true. That's sort of where we have the space to make creative legal arguments as advocates, where the courts have sort of developed certain recognized and sort of specified particular social groups. So for example, folks who identify as members of the LGBT community, there's sort of precedent and established law that constitutes a cognizable particular social group. You'll also notice importantly that there's nowhere on there is listed gender. And that is where it's been decades long efforts to add that to the definition, although it hasn't been, and we've stuck it into membership in a particular social group and made particular social groups that sort of fit around the issue of gender and the way that shows up in society. And so this is a little bit about how our asylum system in the US has been sort of mapped out on paper. And we'll talk a little bit about on the next slide about how it works sort of more in process. So as I mentioned, Sarah, if you want to go, there we go to the next one. As I mentioned, in order to be applying for asylum, you have to be present in the United States. Sometimes people are present in the United States with status, like they've come as a student, or they've come as a, visitor or something like that, and they decide whether or not they sought that visa to get entry and then apply for asylum, or if something changes while they're here and they're then afraid to return to their country, they might submit an application for asylum in a way that we refer to as an affirmative application. So they have decided that for whatever reason they are afraid, and they can apply affirmatively for this benefit. They are processed then through the asylum office. And then if the asylum office, so not in court, but there are asylum officers who are specially trained on adjudicating asylum claims, they are the ones who determine, like, did you meet this requirement? Have you been harmed in the past, or is the harm that you fear on account of one of these correct, one of these five things? Or was it just generalized violence in your country? And then if the asylum officer can grant asylum, the applicant will then be designated as an asylee, which is sort of a lifetime status, and they will be put on a path to permanent residence and then eventually be able to apply for citizenship.
Nicole, sorry.
Yeah.
Can I interrupt you briefly?
Yeah.
So there's a question here in the chat, but also I think you just named it right about, is it just general violence? So maybe you could respond to the question, which is, can social groups also be different economic classes, like wealthy or poor, and what that means in terms of like general versus acute?
Yep. So the persecution, it's interesting, and I think it's something that even those of us who do this work a lot, like we grapple with, because we come from this idea of like Afghanistan, for example, or take Vietnam after the war or something like this. Oftentimes in the global sort of scene, we see tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people from a country designated as refugees, like don solo, right? Like big sweeping designation. I mean, everybody has to submit the right paperwork, but we have decided that, this particular, people from this particular country are going to be processed as refugees. And so asylum, on the other hand, is a very individualized determination. And so you have to show that you were targeted for persecution, you yourself, on account of one of those five things. So generalized country violence, like gangs are rampant in my country and literally everyone is at risk of death every day, and I've got tons of proof about this, is not enough. Unless the gang or the whoever has targeted you because of something about yourself, you will probably not meet the standard and be granted asylum. As I mentioned, something about you, about yourself, it also has to be, to get to this other question, something that you can't change. So in immigration law, that's called an immutable characteristic, so you can't change it. So unfortunately, things like poverty or economic status, or even certain professions, if you were targeted because you were a taxi driver, and the gang or the criminal organization like uses taxi drivers to do their deeds or whatever, you can just stop being a taxi driver and move on. That's a little distinction in that, like, professions that sort of come with, like, a physician could always be forced to like perform medical duties or whatever beyond. So there are certain professions that have been found to be immutable. Most often though, like, you can quit working at a bank, you can quit driving a taxi, you can quit. So unless it's something that is you cannot or should not be made to change, then it isn't a protected ground. So I think I was in the middle of affirmative or defensive. Does that seem to address okay. So if the asylum office cannot grant, so if they don't think someone meets the standard for asylum, they do what, it's not a denial, but they do what's called a referral to immigration court. So the applicant, who again may have been here on a student visa or on a tourist visa, if their application cannot be granted, they are referred to immigration court, placed into deportation proceedings, and then can present their asylum claim again as a defense to deportation. So I'm going to take a pause on those folks who entered with lawful status and are doing that affirmatively, and move to those who never went through that process, but may have come into the United States without documentation or present themselves at a port of entry or at a border to say, I'm afraid to return to my country. Those folks just go immediately into immigration court, in the sense that they don't get the option to apply affirmatively. They're not, sort of in this non-adversarial process first. They go immediately into this, a defense to their deportation. So there are lots of things happening at the border, which we will talk about, but most often under how the system is supposed to work, if a non-citizen has presented themselves to an immigration officer and says, I am afraid to return to my country, they cannot, under international sort of agreements that we've made and standards that we hold ourselves to, they cannot be returned to their country of origin without process. So sometimes on the border or at a port of entry, like if you show up at an airport or something and say that, airport in the United States, very distinct from trying to do that abroad, you might be given what's called a credible fear interview. So sometimes asylum applicants are made to go through this sort of initial interview that's a pretty low threshold and just shows that you are telling the truth and that there's some chance you might be able to prevail in immigration court. So it's sort of this initial hurdle that some asylum seekers are made to go over. I say some because all of this, how someone is treated when they present themselves at the border, whether or not they get a credible fear interview, and or this last bullet point of whether or not they're detained while they wait, are all discretionary decisions. So there is no mandated process. They just all exist, and it varies greatly depending on which part of the border you present at, which person is in the White House, all kinds of factors that are beyond the asylum seeker's control. And so I think when we talk about these decisions, again, discretionary decisions, things like detention bed mandates, so contracts that the US government holds with private prisons, certainly does affect probably the decision makers' ultimate decision about, do I detain this person or do I not? Well, if I've contracted to pay for a bed and I could just decide to detain this person, then maybe why wouldn't I? And so I did want to mention too, as it comes to detention, if folks are detained throughout their the whole sort of asylum process, those cases do move more quickly. So maybe someone might be looking at like 6 to 9 months or maybe a year, as opposed to if someone does come into the United States and is put into proceedings but not detained and seeking asylum, it might be looking at 2 or 3 or 5 or more years. So a long time. This takes a long time, and that may come on a future slide. Sorry if I jumped ahead. Okay, this one is a lot of information that we just threw on here, but I think as most of you are probably aware, a lot has changed in asylum law or in the system of asylum in the United States in the last 5 years. So principally since the beginning of the Trump administration. I think we saw it start a couple years prior in that under Obama, there was certainly sort of this initial, but sort of renewed what they would refer to as an influx, or lots more women and children entering the United States from our southern border and claiming asylum. This is where the beginning of the family detention system, so the system of detaining women and children upon entry to the United States and processing them through that credible fear process, began under the Obama administration. And but with the start of the Trump administration, the attacks on the asylum system just became so incredibly calculated and constant. So you can see a lot of dates up there, and I'm not going to hammer on those, but in the last few years, we saw Attorney General decision that absolutely obliterated the ability of women who had been in sort of intimate partner or domestic violence relationships, their ability to seek protection in the United States under our asylum law. Same with claims one of the particular social groups that previously had been held to be sort of cognizable or sort of blessed by the immigration system, precedential, was family relationships. So if I was targeted for harm on account of my family relationship to my father, for example, they were looking for my father for whatever reason, they had maybe tried to harm him, but they were seeking to harm me to sort of get to him. That was also something that the Attorney General under Trump had attacked and sort of taken away the ability of applicants in that category to seek asylum. Of course, I hope that most of you have heard about the MPP program, the Migrant Protection Protocols, a misnomer, but we like to refer to it as Remain in Mexico, that made even pre-pandemic forced asylum seekers, mostly from Central America, but really from all over the world, to wait in Mexico after presenting themselves and trying to avail themselves of this legal process of seeking asylum. They were told, first, take a number and wait God knows how long, weeks or months, in a border city for your number to be called. And once you take a number, or once your number is up, we'll bring you in for a day, we'll get your information, and we'll send you back to Mexico to await a court date. So again, that's sort of about a year and a half before the pandemic started. That had been put into place, and tens of thousands of people were made to remain in Mexico while they tried to have, court dates in the United States, trying to access legal representation and all kinds of hurdles. Other things that the Trump administration attempted to do were to make rules that said, for example, that had you not applied for asylum in, let's say, Mexico, if you're coming from Central America and traveling through Mexico or Guatemala and Mexico, if you had not applied for asylum in those countries, then you were ineligible to apply for asylum in the United States. Lots of these things, all of these things, I think, have been sort of, lawsuits have been filed against them. They're in various states of either enjoined or stayed or all kinds of things. Some of it, though, like, of course, MPP has been in the news more recently because it sort of is still being fought about. There's been changes about work permit eligibility and how long folks have to wait. Again, something that we've used the courts to sort of fight back against and have like temporary measures. And then sort of the most tragic, or certainly most recent thing that you may have seen in the news is, because of the public health crisis, both the past administration and this current one is continuing to carry the torch of the idea that we can't allow asylum seekers to come into the United States because they might pose a public risk to public health. And so they're using what's called Title 42, which is a part of the law that says that they can just expel. So different than deport or remove, or but they can expel people from the border to home country with no process, no seeing of a judge, no hearings, no opportunity to present any sort of asylum claim. And so, for example, the Haitians that were featured very prominently in last week's news in Del Rio, Texas, all of those folks were expelled under Title 42. So that continues to be a really tragic piece of just really, again, executive decisions that are being made that are not mandated by the law to curtail the access of folks to our asylum system. I feel like I touched on what we were hoping, Sarah.
Yeah, I think so. I think what we're seeing, right, is the same thing that we've talked about in other 101 spaces, where immigration law has never actually been based on inclusion, right? It's been on creating categories of exclusion and like reasons that we could expel people, or like not, I mean, like the language even in that is just awful. So maybe we have time to get into that in Q&A. So I want to take us maybe through the journey of what asylum could look like from a St. Louis-based perspective. So an individual who might seek asylum, and we're going to use Honduras as an example here, right? The first step, right, is to travel to the United States. You have to get to one of the borders or ports of entry, right? So including like an international airport, if you've traveled from outside the United States, and the first touchdown, like where you land, that's considered a port of entry. And then certainly across the borders. Then you have to get into the US, and Nicole just talked about that, right? And how many people are still getting turned away. if you get into the United States, you might spend several days in what's sometimes referred to as la hielera, the freezer, right? Which are basically, and I'm sure by this point you've seen them in the news, right? Holding rooms where too many people are placed, if you want to ask my opinion, in one space while they're being processed by CBP. Then you might be able to obtain a bond or parole in order to be released from detention. And we just had, I know a couple of you on the call here, right, have just been in border facilities recently and have seen how even when you're released from detention, that sometimes means being sort of dumped on a street, that sometimes means being dropped off near a church or a migrant attention center. Then you have to take the hurdle of getting to St. Louis or to whichever destination. But for example, if we're talking about someone from El Paso, or someone who crossed in El Paso, right? They have, to figure out how to get to St. Louis, some 1,200 miles from where they were. Once you're in St. Louis, you generally, most of the people that IFCLA has the opportunity to know, have to check in at ICE, and you usually are given a date once you're in the border. Your paperwork that you're sent out with has a date that says you need to go to the ICE office by this time. Then usually what we're seeing most commonly is that then the ICE agent here in St. Louis refers you to ISAP, which is a subcontractor, it's a program run by BI Incorporated. And many of those, BI Incorporated, by the way, which is a subsidiary of GEO Group, the second largest private prison industry in the United States. ISAP is the ankle monitors, and we've talked about that, but we've talked about that in other spaces. I'd be happy to talk about it further here. But basically in St. Louis, it's not uncommon to see folks wearing an ankle monitor for upwards of 2 years while they're waiting for their date in court.
I'm going to go ahead and just address a couple questions that came across in the chat because I think it makes more sense to do it right now.
Sure.
That's a great question, Maureen. I don't, about the question was, do they apply Title 42 to some, how do they apply Title 42 to some, but not all? Again, the border is a ginormous mess on a good day, and I cannot explain to you how some folks are still able to get across. I know that the folks that we've assisted or, connected to border organizations have been able to apply for what's called a Title 42 exemption. So for some reason, like for example, they're an unaccompanied minor, or we had a case where a family member of one of our MICA project clients had come to the border with his pregnant partner. They had, the day they were coming across, they were in the United States, being sort of in the border processing center. She went into labor and was taken, they were told, okay, you're going to go to St. Louis or whatever to meet your family. She went into labor and was taken to the hospital, and he was sent back to Matamoros, I think. And so we were able to connect him to a border organization that got him sort of paroled into the United States under an exemption to Title 42. So it's not fair. I'm not going to say I wish they were applying it across the board, because I wish they weren't applying it at all. But again, that's something else that has been, advocate groups have sued against the use of Title 42. I think most recently it came out that the Biden administration is going to defend the use of Title 42. So there is that. MPP, to my knowledge, and again, this is stuff that I feel like I should be a total expert on, but it just is always in flux. No one knew, I think I can say confidently, no one knew is being put into MPP, like folks who come present at the border, they're either being expelled under Title 42 or just returned away, refused. So no one's being like the metering, the list numbers and such. They're not like calling out numbers on the list anymore. So people aren't being like processed in and like removal proceedings commenced against them, even though they're outside. It's like such a brain, it messes with you. But so no one knew is being put into MPP. For a while at the beginning of the Biden administration, folks that were previously in MPP were being processed through. So they were able to apply, submit their information that, I've been in MPP and now we're ending MPP supposedly. And at least at the time, that was what was happening, and people were allowed to come in. But right now that sort of MPP is in flux, but to my knowledge is not growing. It's just not totally over yet. And we're hoping it doesn't get reinstated.
But we also had pre-MPP, right, programs, lots of different policies where people could be presented to the border, are processed or not in varying degrees, and are still dropped off in Mexico. I mean, I remember 15 years ago or so working in the border, and folks that would be processed here and be deported, there was like a bus that would drive across the border, or actually to the border, and an agent would walk them across, like up to the actual like door, and like they would walk back. And so I think it's a different two questions in there about how folks are being returned and how they're being processed abroad. Or
Right, absolutely. So back to kind of the journey of asylum and the asylum process. Once, as Sarah mentioned in this last slide, people are processed in whatever way they're processed on the border, and if they are allowed to come, for example, and resettle in St. Louis, either to be with family or because they've heard it's so cheap to live here, whatever reason it is that brings them here, they're told, hopefully, I think, that they'll have a court date. And so they have to find legal representation if they want to be able to successfully represent themselves in immigration court. So the asylum application is 12 pages long. The law says you have to submit that within 1 year of your arrival, and which does not count, stupidly in my opinion, but if you say that you're afraid at the border, or if you even do a credible fear interview, but for a lawsuit that was filed, that wouldn't count as meeting your 1 year deadline. You actually have to fill out this 12-page application and submit it to the court, and the court has to receipt it within that first year. So submitting it to the court, you have to send a copy to the government's attorney, you have to send a copy somewhere else so they can give you a fingerprint appointment, and of course, attend all of your court hearings, so you don't get deported what's called in absentia. If you just miss one, or even if sometimes if you're like a half hour, an hour late, if the judge has gone through the docket and you're not there, they can order you removed in absentia, so in your absence. And then once you hopefully have completed your asylum application and submitted it to all the right places, preparing for what's like a trial, we call it a merits hearing in immigration law, can be a pretty daunting task as well. Most of the time, of course, if we're representing someone, we would want to submit a written affidavit, so sort of like a sworn statement about their story, getting their story sort of all out in writing, which, as you can imagine, especially in stories where, or circumstances where there's been past trauma, can be an incredible task to do. If you have evidence like medical reports or police reports or any other sort of documentation, newspaper article or whatever, those all have to be translated into English. If you are able to get sort of outside validation of the harm that you've suffered, so be it physical, like a forensic exam, or if you have emotional or psychological trauma and can have a mental health evaluation done, that can be turned in. Sometimes we utilize expert witnesses, either reports that have been prepared more generally or testimony about an individual's case or circumstance. And then if possible, sort of letters of support from family who was maybe present when your persecution happened, or folks who have come to the United States for the same reasons. And then general country condition evidence. So a ginormous packet of papers gets sent, of course, because it's paper, because it's immigration. So we still do things in paper form in 2021, and sent to the court, sent to the government attorney, and ahead of your trial date or your merits hearing date. And then I sort of skipped through, but you'll have these preliminary hearings at the beginning, and that final merits hearing date often is about 3 to 5 years after folks have arrived to the United States. And that's with no like court closures or just continuances because the judge is gone or God knows what other reason. But often a long time after you've arrived to the United States, preparing for your verbal testimony. My office is right by Barnes Jewish Hospital, so we have sirens all day long. So I apologize for that. And then, as I mentioned, you submit all that evidence 30 days before that hearing. Our court is in Kansas City, so we don't have a court in St. Louis. I think there's like 30 something courts in the United States. So Kansas City is far, but there are other places that are even more sort of remote. And then you're in this sort of merits hearing trial for 2, 3, 4 hours, depending on the amount of testimony. And the judge can make the decision that day, or he, because there are 3 judges in Kansas City and they're all males, or he can send a written decision. If someone is not granted asylum, so if they lose or are denied, there is an appeal process. They have the right to appeal, but again, need a lawyer to help them through that process, certainly. It's just its whole own thing.
So I want to go even further in of like, what does this whole process, now that you have like the context for it and this sort of outline for it, what does that look like in Missouri and how many are we seeing, right? Because I really appreciate this journey that Nicole just painted that acts like, or speaks from the place of having badass attorneys like Nicole and Chris Walentic and Jess and all the folks that we have in St. Louis that can do that, that we magically pretend have unlimited capacity and can take every case that calls their office, which is not true. And so I want to give a perspective about how many we're talking about in St. Louis, in Missouri, and what that looks like. And as you might imagine, getting data about people who seek asylum is not easy. And I think part of the reason for that comes from the understanding that many people, I would say, and I'm going to show you that the majority of people who seek asylum in Missouri are people that have come from the border, who were processing the border and are filing defensive applications, right? And so they're not in an affirmative application, which means it's a defense to deportation. And so maybe there's some trickery to figuring out how you would tabulate or count those numbers of cases. What you can do is count the number of deportation proceedings that are filed in court and kind of use some of the other data about the numbers of asylum decisions and the numbers of affirmative and defensive sort of applications and put it together. So when you look at this data, we would look at this blue section and the red section or maroon section that's entry without inspection and other immigration charges. And you could kind of combine those numbers together. So this is looking at in 2021. So this is January 1st through August 31st this year. There were about 2,700 deportation cases filed in Missouri, and like 98% of those cases are in those blue and red, maroon, whatever color that looks like on your screen categories combined, right? And so that usually means those are people that appeared at a port of entry and were admitted, as Nicole talked about, that's roughly like 2,400 people. So of these, we could say very conservatively that slightly more than half would be people who aspire to seek asylum. And that would, I'm pulling that number following some national trends. I'm trying not to overwhelm with data, but also give you some. So in Missouri, that could be roughly like 1,400 people who have arrived in Missouri this year who intend to seek asylum. I would actually argue that this number is probably much higher, because what we're looking at are both proceeding filings and asylum decisions, which, as you can imagine, the decision is going to come delayed, right, from the filing. So I think there's also, if you have this like 1,400 in your brain, there's also the backbone of all of the anecdotal evidence that we see from many people at ISPN, and including folks like the Micah Project and our friends at CLAM, who are so overwhelmed with intake, so overwhelmed with the number of people calling, the demand is so high that then we're in this space of like, well, what do we do? And I briefly just want to throw out that, you know, in this affirmative defensive, for example, in 2020, 90% of cases filed nationwide, asylum cases filed nationwide, were defensive, 90%. That's a little bit maybe skewed because of the court closures from 2020. So the past 3 years has averaged closer to 85% nationwide defensive applications. So the overwhelming majority are folks who are people seeking asylum do so defensively. In Kansas City, it's certainly higher. So our numbers have been over 90% defensive applications since like 2015. So one other thing I want to go into, and this slide, I didn't update the title. So this is not asylum outcomes. These are asylum denials. So these are the number of cases that are denied each year. And what I'm comparing is nationwide and Kansas City. And again, 2020 numbers are through August. So we're missing a whole fourth quarter of asylum applications, right? So this is the number of decisions. In Kansas City in 2018, 82% of the decisions made in asylum cases were denied, right? So those are, and if you go in even further, you can look at the number of cases of people when they had a lawyer versus when they're not, and the percentages for denials go up, right? So your chance of losing is increased when you don't have an attorney. And for what it's worth, in 2021, I want to say there were 37, just to give you a hard number, 37 decisions, which would follow that the courts weren't open for a very long time this year. It's a pretty low number. And 37, 34 of them were denied. That's a 92% denial rate, at the same time that the national average, with the variances in court reopenings and everything, was closer to 65%. Which brings me to now what, right? So how does our community respond? And I think what you've seen is in some of Nicole's communications and mine and from St. Francis, we developed a clinic model for pro se asylum. Pro se asylum, not someone that speaks Latin, is like of yourself, right? Filing asylum on your own. That's how I say it. Correct me, Latin experts in the room, if you would. But what it means is, how can we equip someone, right? The law doesn't say you have to have an attorney in order to seek asylum. But as we've just spent the last hour or so, like, oh my God, how could you possibly navigate this system if you didn't have an attorney, let alone like 12 case managers? I mean, it's just so many pieces, right? So in 2019 was when we launched this model, because even then we're seeing, oh my gosh, there's too many people, right? There's too many people that want to seek asylum for attorneys that are nonprofit, pro bono, low bono attorneys to take the cases, right? And so we developed this model to equip people with the best information possible to be prepared to represent themselves in court. Obviously, this is not a best case scenario. This is trying to do the best we can with the worst case scenario, right? And for a lot of folks, that means, let me explain to you what how you have to tell your story, right? I could tell you that my name's Sarah and I'm from St. Louis, but that tells you a piece of my story. And it's also true to say, and I grew up in Eureka in a geodesic dome. That's a different piece of information. I'm telling you the truth, but I'm telling it to you in different ways. And if you don't understand what ways the court is looking for, it doesn't matter how amazing your case is, they won't hear it, right? It won't matter if it's not told in the right way. And no one's explaining this to people who come to America with an idea of that protection and that lamplight beside the golden door. We continue to change what the model looks like in 2020. Obviously, we invented a virtual model. And I think some of you on this call were volunteers, and we were meeting and doing stuff totally virtually. I had a funder at one point who said, Sarah, can I come to the office and see what's happening? And I was like, I'm sitting in my dining room, probably with no bra on, and there's stuff everywhere, plus my son's toys. But if you want to come see what this looks like come on over, right? There's a lot of back and forth. We finally, in 2021, have done one clinic in person already. We're doing another one this weekend on October 2nd. And I think the point here is that we have to keep evolving what the model looks like. As the needs change, we have to evolve our response to that. Number one is expanding capacity. I know you've seen our posts already about laptops. When we're in a clinic space, what we do basically is have a volunteer attorney who's sometimes an immigration attorney and sometimes not. We have an interpreter, and then we have the individual who is seeking asylum. Then we have a bunch of staff and supervisors and attorneys that are doing all the other stuff, but we basically set up these teams. Each team needs to sit at a computer and fill out this application, and they work through it piece by piece for the whole day. My team at IFCLA right now is rapidly working to fill out the first part of the application before we even get to the clinic day on Saturday, so that we can get to use most of the time on the really hard stuff in a space where you're supported by therapists and attorneys and a community that will provide hospitality and comfort, hopefully. You've also seen that we've sort of emerged out of this the need for work authorization. Not everyone that seeks asylum is eligible for work authorization, but if you go through this asylum process by yourself, getting help for one day to fill out the application, you don't have an attorney that is like going to walk with you through the rest of the process. You do have IFCLA, who's going to walk with you as best as we can as a neighbor, right, through that process. And we were the ones that got the calls to say, wait, how do I get a work permit now that I'm seeking asylum? And that's when we got back together with our partners and developed a work authorization clinic model. And we're going to have to continue those, right? So the people who are eligible can get work authorization while they're waiting for their asylum decision, right? Now we're also evolving again, and what you're going to hear about probably within the next month is a community intake line. And what we've seen is that folks who want to seek asylum, our old model has relied on having the nonprofit law firms intake every call. Every person has to go to either MICA or St. Francis Community Services Catholic Legal Assistance Ministry, which I call CLAM. But I think I'm maybe not supposed to do that. But it's a lot of words. Okay, Chris, we could say they either have to go to Nicole or Chris, and they have to talk to someone at their offices who does like the screening for whether or not there might be an asylum claim and whether or not they're eligible to seek asylum. But if everyone is trying to get to those two offices, you can imagine what that capacity looks like. Nicole, has that had an impact in the MICA project recently?
The idea of intake
Yeah.
and screening all these folks. Yeah. So sometimes, actually very frequently, both MICA and CLAM, St. Francis Legal Assistance Ministry, have to close our intake line because, as Sarah mentioned, capacity is very limited. And we haven't talked about the fact that although Sarah has some numbers from 2021 from the Kansas City court, our court has been closed for the last 15 months. So all of those dozens of asylum cases that we were supposed to have heard in 2020 and in 2021 are now on our case lists and caseloads and in our life until 2024 or 2025. So it's sort of it snowballs. And the idea of, yeah, we have to close sometimes for intake and sometimes for months at a time, depending on staffing levels. So getting creative about how to address the community need around asylum and legal representation is something we're sort of constantly re-evaluating.
And so I think within the vision that we have for sort of like creating space for immigrants to lead this movement is also creating this intake line that gets people, immigrants also, like there's a whole team of folks I think who are really excited to think about what this model can look like, where we do offer, and we're not making this model up, right? We're drawing on models that exist in similar cities where folks can have a number to call and talk to someone who's probably not an attorney, but has had some amount of training, some amount of screening, who can generally provide some like yay, nay sorts of ideas about whether or not you're eligible for pro se asylum. Again, what that clinic is the best of the worst, right? The worst case scenario is when you can't find a quality attorney. And the best thing that you can do in that situation is get as much information, knowledge, and support as you can from your community to represent yourself. So that's what we're working on.
I wanted to kind of, before I go into this next slide relatedly, as Sarah said, it's the best of the worst. We don't want to turn away cases. CLAM doesn't want to turn away cases. Like, we want to say yes to every asylum seeker, but this pro se model is sort of what we've come up with that allows folks to, because we believe that everybody has a right to present their asylum claim and that their asylum claim should be heard, and that on the way, their procedural sort of due process rights should be protected. And so that's what this is, right? We don't think it's ideal. It's far from it, but it's been the way that we've been able to assure that people meet that 1-year filing deadline, that folks are not ordered removed in absentia because they know to go to the court date, or not ordered removed because they didn't fill in the right boxes on the thing or forget to turn in the form. And so that's sort of the goal, is to help them move through the process and make sure that they're not missing something small that then prevents them from having their day in court, if you will. So these folks, as Sarah mentioned, are all in removal proceedings. They're presenting this asylum claim as a defense to deportation. And when they do these, when these things are turned in the right ways at the right times, they may be eligible. Many now, thanks, one silver lining of court closures is that more people are eligible for work authorization as a result of the delays. So our work authorization laws are incredibly complicated, but essentially if the government's delay causes you to wait more than a certain amount of time, then they allow you to apply for work authorization. So finding ways to protect the procedural rights in this process is something that's been really important to us along the way.
I think we maybe already covered this, yeah?
Yes.
Great. So just briefly to give a perspective on since we started this model in St. Louis, we've been able to support 154 people to seek asylum without an attorney, right? So that means 82 families that have worked with volunteers through this clinic model have been supported, have preserved their right to seek asylum. And as you can see, you could make some sweeping generalizations, right? Like this is majority folks from Honduras and majority women and children. I would say that the children is maybe inflated in this sense because they are children of the parents who are seeking asylum. So I don't want it to feel separate from oh, these are unaccompanied children. That's not what we're talking about here. And I also just want to be really clear that where if close relationships are obviously to date in a Latino or Spanish speaking audience. And so naturally you're going to see folks from those countries, but we know the needs far exceed just where our relationships are currently. We've also supported 119 work permits, which I think is wild. And I think really briefly, what does a work permit mean? In Missouri, it's a huge amount of access. You get a driver's license, which changes literally everything about when someone asks for identification, when you're pulled over for a burnt out taillight. Having a driver's license for many non-white individuals in St. Louis often means you don't have to go to jail. Social security cards, right? We don't want to fall into a black hole about social security, but thinking about what that number in and of itself sort of can serve. It's obviously access to employment, right? And that is financial stability, that is an ability to put food on the table and really care for your family. And I think that's what is at the center of what we have seen so far with the people that we've been able to accompany.
Before we jump into Afghanistan, Sarah, could you take Shay's question? Because you'll be better at the answer.
Sure. So the question is, I'm reading it out loud because this is recorded, but because of such low asylum rates, like asylum grant rates, high denial rates, are there situations in which someone is applying defensively and you would advise them not to go to their court? So I think in general, my sense from the communities that I've worked with is it's always advantageous to show up to court. I think that there are situations after a decision is made that you might have to figure out what is the best solution for your family and how you might respond. And that might not always mean following explicit instructions given to you by a government who is unable or unwilling to prioritize your dignity and your pain. So are there situations that I could imagine finding strategies to fight unjust laws? Yes. And if those unjust laws are ordering you to be deported or are ordering you to separate from your family, as many of you know, I have no problem showing up to shut that down because that's wrong. Oh, you're muted, Mama.
Sorry, I would just add, she's better at saying some of those things just because obviously as an attorney, I can't advise anyone to do something that, would go against instructions, of course. But I do want to say that another goal of these pro se asylum clinics continues to come from the expressed desire of, you know, dozens, if not hundreds of these folks that we've worked throughout time, that they want to be in the United States. They want to be in the United States and they want to be safe, and they've sought safety in the United States. And so the way, of course, they would love to win their asylum case and be granted lawful status forever, but that we see these pro se asylum clinics as, at minimum, they're giving people 2 to 3 to 4 years plus of safety. They're here, and if they can, again, obtain the benefit of like a work permit and a social security number, and they're here and safe, and, you know, at minimum, maybe those 2 to 3 to 4 years, even if they do end up deciding to, you know, comply or report if they needed to be removed from the United States, which thankfully we're not there, that would give their, you know, whether it's country conditions in their home country, time to settle down, or for them as a family to make a plan for how to stay safe that's maybe not in the United States but somewhere else. And so I think it's a long conversation that has a lot of facets, but you're absolutely right to highlight that this seems really unjust, and why would you want to go present a losing claim? You're not wrong.
I would also say about specific advising not to go to court. I think we haven't seen a pattern of people being apprehended like at that court. And I like to believe that that's because there's still a process for appeal. And so even if you don't go to court, you kind of shoot yourself in the foot, because you won't have an opportunity to appeal, or might not have an opportunity to appeal. But if you show up and are denied, then there's still like more process that could happen that can allow not just space and time, but also perhaps additional legal battles. All right, Nicole.
Yeah, so I think we're going to zoom back out a little bit, sort of back to this global stage, back to sort of the big picture of what is asylum and what does it mean and how does it relate to the more current events happening in Afghanistan. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, refugees are processed outside of the United States, and often large groups of people are designated refugee status. Again, it's still a one-by-one application, but that many people of one sort or nationality or type within a country could be designated as refugees sort of in a shorter period of time. So refugees are meeting that same international standard. The type of harm that folks from Afghanistan are fleeing right now certainly meets the definition of refugee, and could potentially, depending on circumstances, meet the definition for asylum. But again, the people who are arriving to the United States right now, none of them have been processed as refugees. That's a process that, again, you have to be outside of your home country, but also outside of the United States. It's a whole global system through the UN High Commissioner of Refugees, UNHCR, in which you are sort of designated as a refugee, then reassigned, assigned to a country to be resettled in, and then all of that comes. So I certainly hope that process could be expedited for some, but that's often something that takes months, if not years. And so the people who are arriving right now, I have sort of a lot of different legal statuses or sort of background. We are not experts in global refugee processing by any means, and I hope that there's a lot that we can learn in the next while about this. But we do want to take this opportunity to draw sort of the similarities. We've been talking a lot about Central American asylum seekers. We've been talking a lot about sort of the global stage, but there's a lot that's the same between and amongst different groups and places that they're coming from. So on the next slide, we would highlight folks from Afghanistan, folks from Central America, folks from other places across the world often are seeking safety, often are seeking to be close to family, to be able to stay together with their families. Of course, the humanity and dignity of each is equal. No one group or even individual has greater humanity or dignity than the next. And so this system, though, applies to all of them equally, right? Everybody has to be, although thankfully the laws can adjust and should be made to adjust for specific circumstances, like in the example of temporary protected status or these SIVs, special immigrant visas that have been created to respond to specific countries, specific conditions. this is the system that they all have to work from within. I don't know, Sarah, if you about that one.
Oh yeah.
No, did you have anything else to say about?
No, sorry.
Nope. And then so we did, as we mentioned this at the beginning, I'm going to sort of circle back to it. Folks that are coming from Afghanistan right this moment, many of them either were, those who were evacuated specifically, either were US citizens or green card holders, and maybe were able to get their families out of Afghanistan, even if their families didn't have citizenship or permanent residence. And so those folks were allowed to come into the United States under a parole. So they were just paroled in and are referred to, if you've heard folks talk about parolees, that's these people. So parole is it's very distinct from anything in the criminal system, right? We're not talking about parole out of prison, but parole is the sort of that act, that entry. So it's a temporary permission to enter, and generally given for a year in the immigration context. In the case of Afghanistan, it's our understanding it's being given for 2 years. There are folks though who were not able to get evacuated from the country during that couple weeks of intense late August time, as the borders were closing and the airport, the US was leaving Afghanistan. And so those people, if they want to come to the United States, may be submitting like another type of parole application, which is called humanitarian parole. Photos here of a couple examples of like what it takes to do that. And if they are granted humanitarian parole, maybe they have an aunt who lives in St. Louis who's a green card holder, and she's able to somehow connect with us, and they're able to submit those applications. They will have to get out of Afghanistan. They will have to get to some sort of embassy in order to get, it's basically a visa, but it's called a boarding foil in their passports, and they will have to come to the United States and enter. They'll be allowed to stay here for those 2 years, but as the law stands, they will have to somehow get on some other path. Parole is not a path to permanent status. So they might be submitting a family-based petition, again, if they have the right family relationship with the right person that has the right kind of legal status, they might be able to do that, or many of them may be seeking asylum. And so to sort of bring it back to our theme of today, they may be in this very similar situation. They would start on that affirmative process, as I talked about at the beginning. They would be able to have their claims heard in the asylum office before they would go to immigration court. But there's sort of this looming future legal need when it comes to the Afghan situation.
So I know we have gone through a lot. I want to get to what we're going to have time for questions and like discussion. And maybe I think before we do that, I just want to pop out some ideas of like, what could you do next? Where can you go with this information? How can you use this for good, right? And I think it goes without saying that that IFCLA always shows up in these spaces with the hope of an opportunity for personal transformation. So if it causes something different within you, then that is what I want you to explore. And I would invite you to like think about what are those like knee-jerk reactions that you're having, or the questions that you're having, and well, what about this and what about that, and go back to the questions about choice and really dig into like, what does that mean or look like, and where might we need to unpack some of our internal biases about that. But I also want to leave you with some specifics. So you can volunteer. Here is the link, and I'm going to pop it into the chat. If you are interested in volunteering at the Pro Se clinics, with the hotline, with like a million other things, you can sign up here. It's an IFCLA page, but we'll share it with Micah Project so that in those intersection needs, we work pretty closely together, in case you haven't realized. And so when Nicole says, we need someone who can blah, 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 you'll get an ask from IFCLA to amplify that request as well. So this is your starting point. If you have already signed up for IFCLA volunteer stuff, I would encourage you just to sign it up. There's a lot of optional questions. It's asking a lot of information, but don't be overwhelmed. You can skip a lot of it because it's also an intern application. So just go ahead and pop it in there and let us know so we can make sure that you're in the right place in the database to be identified. Second thing is that we, as you know, as the backbone fiscal sponsoring organization for the ISPN, the Immigrant Service Providers Network. There is a community forum, the first in a series of forums, hopefully, this Thursday. And that is a good place for you to hear from other service providers in St. Louis, in the region, about what's going on, specifically as it relates to new arrivals, as the taboo word, people that are showing up recently, showing up now, how to respond now, and what are those impacts already looking like. And then obviously, you've probably identified a list of things that you're shaking your fist about. And those are opportunities that you can advocate, right? It goes without saying that I think the law needs to be reimagined. I think we've created laws based on other values that are not the ones that you and I want to see in our community. And so that means we have to figure out how to change them. And I think it looks at root causes. I think it looks, our organization is looking at not necessarily reforming institutions that at their core are in contrast with our values, right? An institution that like the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that similar to like parallel conversations, right, that are created, an institution that is designed to criminalize and to separate is not one that can be reformed. It has to be abolished. And that creates an opportunity to replace it with something else, replace it with something that's rooted in other values. There is an opportunity to be involved currently this week. The Congress is supposed to pass a budget, emphasis on supposed to pass a budget. And there's been a lot of talk about what can that mean for people who are undocumented or with temporary statuses in the United States. And Rita Chang of our office has been running the Dignity Not Dollars campaign. So we'll make sure to follow up in an email. What are some things that you can do right now? Certainly, we will continue to push things longer term about how we think asylum should be changed. And you'll be hearing later this year, I believe, from a group of leaders, individuals in our community who are seeking asylum, who have an ankle monitor or have recently had one removed. This group is called Migrantes Unidos, and they've been meeting monthly for over a year, not just to provide support to each other, but also to like prescribe what action and change they want to see. And IFCLA is working to amplify that alongside MICA as well. So you'll hear more from them coming soon, but that is sort of the way that we are shifting. Nicole, do you want to speak about sponsorship?
And if Emily is still on here, this is part of my response to you and your question. I take no credit at all, but Jessica Mayo from my office we had some former clients from Afghanistan who she has been working just almost nonstop with since mid-August to help in whatever way with, I think it's up to like over 100 individuals in Afghanistan some of whom are submitting these humanitarian parole applications. So specifically to sort of what's next or action opportunities in the event you feel like you're in a position to provide some financial information that may benefit the parole application of one of these individuals. So often the sponsor or the person who they are sort of coming to be with, or that their contact in the United States may be sponsoring multiple families or may be of limited means themselves, but they do have to show sort of certain thresholds financial resources in order to be approved for humanitarian parole. So we have used in the few that we filed and continue to file co-sponsors, so folks who are well-meaning and kind and are blessed with resources to be able to show that in the event it was needed, they would have someone else in a community behind them. And it's honestly just sort of like the key to the door when it comes to, the bureaucrat who's reviewing these applications and checking boxes is able to just check, okay, and this person gets approved. So I'm happy to talk to anyone more about that. Jessica's email is on there and mine is available as well if you have questions.
Also wanted to give a quick shout out to St. Francis Community Services, the third part of the Pro Se trio here. And they have launched a program called Abriendo Puertas, which is a project that is welcoming like more than 25, I forget which number Meredith said last week, of newly arrived asylum seeking families. And there are some pretty specific needs and some, like, if I'm being honest, easy asks to like, here, knock this out, and it makes a difference in people's lives. And then finally, oh geez, I'm not sure how I did that one. Then finally, of course, you know that all of our organizations rely on your financial support to make this possible. So I'm going to plug all three of us there. We know that there's a ton of agencies in St. Louis and beyond that are doing incredible work. And so we are grateful for any support that you can offer. And I think I'm going to, for once, stop screen sharing and pop back all the little bubbles and remove our little spotlights. How do I do this? Great. And I think if you are switching to gallery view, then you can see everyone on the screen, and we have about 10 minutes for questions. So thanks. Feel free to come off mute or pop it in the chat or whatever you need.
Sarah, this is Emily from KUCC.
Hi, Em.
So I would rather support these organizations that you listed. My team is wondering about going through the International Institute and what they're doing, the team at KUCC.
Sure.
So where do you think our support, I think I know the answer to this already, but I mean, do you see, and I'm obviously struggling for the right words.
That's okay.
A better way, or the best way for us to?
Yeah, I think the simple answer is that different organizations are working in different aspects of the same injustices, right? And so the International Institute, as you know, is the only agency in St. Louis that receives federal funding for refugees. And so they are working, and I was just in a conversation with Blake Hamilton last week. They're working to figure out how to fundraise beyond that so that they can give immediate assistance to people that are seeking asylum, people that are processed as special immigrant visas, people that are processed as humanitarian parole. But their services are focused on refugees. And so while we need those services and we need their presence in our community, they're not always able to give the kind of funding or financial support or accompaniment support or legal support for people who are seeking asylum, people that are undocumented and want to seek asylum, people that are in removal proceedings. And so I think it kind of just depends on where your agency maybe has relationship, not your agency, where your congregation like has relationship, and where that feels like a place that you can give. I think, you know, I can look at our budget, I can look at their budget, I can tell you about the vast discrepancies, and I can also tell you that they're serving people that I don't have relationships to, right? That I am less able to serve. And so I think it is a both and.
Okay, thank you. That clears it up for me. Thank you.
I would also encourage you, Emily, if you can share the link for Thursday to your committee, because I think that there are lots of different organizations that might have different kinds of particular needs that would be helpful from a congregation perspective, like a drive for this or a drive for that, that would be folks that are supporting newly arrived, I'm thinking quickly, like mothers and diapers and things that new moms need and things that families need in their arrival process. And the ISPN has been working to consolidate sort of some of that information to see, like, across the city, you know, what are the agencies that are supporting individuals in this first year sort of arrival in 12 months. And so we'll be talking about that again on Thursday.
Okay, good. I will do that. Thank you.
Yeah, good questions. Anybody else? Last call. Oh, great. Okay. Curious to learn about ankle monitors. Hey. Okay, 9 minutes. Oh man, and I haven't cussed once today. I've been doing so good. Okay, so basically, the United States created a series of alternatives to detention programs as the sort of guise in which these programs are under. One of them is called ISAP, the Intensive Supervision Appearance Program. And I'm happy to sort of follow up or send you some details after this, Lauren, but I don't mean to dump sort of like, here's a bunch of acronyms, got it? But ISAP is basically a 24/7 monitoring system. So the surveillance, there's sort of like 3 different layers of surveillance. One of them, sort of first stage, is an ankle monitor. And so these are used, they're like the same, we have slides in other presentations, as like what you would see for someone on house arrest. It's like a black, like box about this big that is placed on the individual. And the idea is that it will like ensure that they show up for court. It's ensuring compliance. So some of us would wonder, like, first of all, if I'm here seeking asylum, do I really need to be convinced to go to court to tell a judge that I need protection here? Like, that's such a backward sort of mentality. And it didn't start with asylum seekers, I would say. It started with people who were being apprehended in the interior of the country, who were being put in jail. And quite frankly, we had a bunch of activists who were like, people shouldn't be in jail. And the government was like, great, we can make a private contract and make a shit ton of money off people while we put them in ankle monitors, and they're still waiting. So I think that is the other piece there is money, right? And so this is a huge contract. GEO Group has held the contract, I think, since Rita, correct me if you know off the top of your head, like 2014. And BI Incorporated is the St. Louis, there's like GEO Group, and then they have like a bunch of subsidiaries, and BI Incorporated is the one here in St. Louis. In fact, the office is, do you know where the Upper Limits rock climbing gym is? Right behind like the wheel now. It's sort of like in this massive construction of soccer, but in that same building, it's on like the 5th floor if you go in the back way, not the rock climbing way, but the other door. And so it's, I think there's a lot of challenges that our organizations have worked with about ankle monitors, because I think that they're operating under false pretext, like alternative, like these individuals wouldn't be in detention anyway. So why are you putting them on an ankle monitor? I think the second piece is it's fraught with injustice. So there's very little oversight and it's huge discretion. So there's like one agent in St. Louis that gets to decide whether or not folks have a monitor on or not, whether or not they get removed. And our teams worked really hard over the last 19, 20, 21, 17, 18, 5 years to figure out like, what is this like non-spoken policy about like, what are the boxes that have to get checked in order that I can get the monitors off? Then if you get the monitor off, sometimes you're transitioned to an app on your phone that has, voice monitoring, or a voice like call in to check in, or a screen facial recognition like check in, because part of the ankle monitors is that it usually requires a once a month check-in. So like you have to go to the office and talk to one of these employees of this private subcontractor who tout themselves as case managers. That's how the language that the government uses in the job posting descriptions, which I think for a lot of social workers find to be really egregious, that this is like not case management. This is like ensuring that you show up to be deported. But I think the other piece is that space is limited access. So like attorneys aren't able to accompany their clients into these private conversations where they're being asked to turn in passports, where they're being asked to just buy your plane ticket, where they're being grilled about whether or not they're working, and do they know that, they can be deported if they lie and they're working in the United States. Like there's a lot of trauma, I think, that happens in those individual spaces. And there's some physical trauma. This is the longest answer ever. Last piece I'll say is like, there's physical trauma. Nicole and I worked frantically with a client, I guess maybe 3 months ago, who had been on the monitor for a year and a half and had a baby, and with the with them. Let's pause there, right? This woman had to give birth with an ankle monitor that if you don't charge it enough, it like talks to you like battery low, like did that, then started breastfeeding and was getting shocked when she put her child to her breast. And it took 3 days, I think, for us to like convince the agent. Like his first question was like, I need proof that she's pregnant. And it's like, really? And like, I need like, just like irrational, right? And then it was like, oh, I looked at the wrong file or some other reason that then finally he changed his response, because like those of you who know me know that I was like, La Leche League is going to be all over this. We're going to have like naked breasted women out in a protest, and I was going to, and then he like took it off, which is great, which is what he should have done. But also I think the shocks are not uncommon among people that wear the ankle monitors. I think it just struck a particular nerve as a mom that has breastfed, that like you couldn't even feed your own baby because of a monitor that should never be on your body in the first place. So in the Asylum leadership group, the folks talk a lot about how do we understand this as control and like keep me subordinate and like keep me quiet and keep me in a place of fear, and what that feels like and what we do with that information. If that helps. We'll be happy to talk much more about that. Hey, Marie.
I have a question about, they keep reporting that these people have entered illegally.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what I don't understand. They've come through and you have to be in the United States to seek asylum. So how is it illegal?
Nicole, you want to take that one?
They should hire you, Maureen, as their PR person, because you're absolutely right. It is not, they have not entered illegally. So that, yep, it's seeking asylum is a legal right. And yep. And even if you enter without inspection or try to come across without, once you encounter an immigration officer, you have the right to say, I'm afraid to return to my country, and be processed as such. So there's some nuance, but you're absolutely right that it is not illegal to come and say, hey, United States, please adjudicate my asylum claim.
I think, Maureen, like, that I would add language about what we're actually trying to communicate about dignity when we use that kind of language, right? When someone is illegal or undocumented, we're putting them in a certain category of person, right? We're making a judgment about their value. And we can say that, like, that's one thing that I remember, like, first learning about, like, wait a minute, you don't get asylum at the border, right? Like I probably, like many of you, I thought like you show up and say, I want to seek asylum. And then you get some piece of paper that's like, great, this person's going to seek asylum. Come on in and go through the process. And actually the come on in is like a little bit from a non-attorney perspective, like, well, we think you don't have a viable claim and we think we're going to deport you anyway. So come on in so that we can deport you. And you enter the country with removal proceedings. And good luck if you have like figuring out that you haven't actually sought asylum and you need an attorney or like need guidance to be able to do that, right? Some of the first people that we saw were like, hey, I'm seeking asylum and blah, blah, blah. And we're like, great, can we see your application? And they're like, here's the papers they gave me at the border, and had no idea that to date, they haven't actually sought asylum. They might have told an officer, like Nicole mentioned, in the border that I'm afraid to go home. And that was enough to allow that or enable that agent to sort of admit them to be removed rather than just remove them. But it's the same sort of circle, right? And so I think in some ways I'm trying to think about how do we change that language intentionally to talk about like people who are undocumented are also seeking asylum. Like that was the first pie chart that I showed you. Like we want to make these categories that like, oh, you're undocumented because you chose, but you're an asylum seeker means like you were still in this like bad circumstances. So you're like a little better than people that just choose it. And I actually think like, actually it's problematic to make hierarchies of value based on immigration status anyway, but also within those specific things, like people who are undocumented and seeking asylum, like until your asylum application is approved, are you an asylee, in my opinion? And so like, then, like if you're seeking asylum, you're undocumented, you don't have status. And so like, what do we do with that? How does that change the way we can talk about these issues and think about families and life?
But we all know how important words are. And when you have Mayorkas yesterday saying, you know, these people came illegally and I've told them not to come. I mean, I argue so much with friends who say, but it's illegal. And I'm like, no, it's not illegal.
Well, now you'll have my slides and you can cite the source, right? Here's the convention and here's the protocols, and they have a right to seek asylum. And they showed up because they couldn't get it beforehand. So why don't we fix that? And in the meantime, they're here doing the lawfully correct thing, and they don't have status yet, and they won't have it until the end. So like, I hear you. You know, I get on a rant about it, Maureen. And you do it without cussing, I know. So, so point for you. All right, y'all, 1:32. I've taken more of your time. Thank you for staying. Thank you for your questions. I will follow up with email. You'll get a copy of the slides. The recording, if I'm being honest, probably won't be posted till after the Asylum Clinic this weekend. So look for the recording next week. We'll give instructions about that. And that's all I have. I see
one more question. Angel's presentation on racism and immigration, I thought you were going to send that out and I never got it.
You might be right about that, Maureen. I will double check. I know I was working on it at some point, and it might be up and I never told anyone that it was up, or it might actually be up. It might just be sitting on my desktop. So I will follow up with you and make sure that gets live.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks
everybody.